In medieval Europe, childbirth was less a joyous event and more a gamble with death. Women faced labor without anesthesia, medical knowledge, or proper hygiene. Blood loss, infections, and obstructed births claimed countless lives. The church often interpreted difficult labors as punishments for sin, urging prayers instead of treatment. Poor women gave birth in straw-filled huts, while noble women labored in drafty castle chambers surrounded by midwives who relied on charms and herbs rather than proven remedies. Mothers prayed for survival, clutching relics and holy crosses, while their families waited in fear. For every healthy child born, there were countless women who never rose again, their names forgotten except in hushed whispers. The truth remains. Medieval childbirth was one of the deadliest experiences a woman could endure. In an age where doctors barely understood the body, childbirth was among the most lethal risks for women. Mortality rates were staggering. Nearly 1 in 3 mothers faced death either during delivery or shortly after. Hemorrhage and fever were common killers, worsened by the lack of sterile instruments. Wealthy women sometimes had physicians, but their treatments often did more harm than good. Bloodletting, bizarre concoctions of herbs, and untested remedies were forced upon mothers in agony. For peasants, the situation was worse. They had only midwives who relied on whispered traditions passed from generation to generation. The death of a mother left newborns vulnerable, often abandoned or handed to wet nurses. Many children also died in infancy, creating a cycle of grief. For medieval women, marriage meant not only partnership, but the looming shadow of the birthing beat-a-bed that too often became a coffin. Behind castle walls and village cottages, the true horrors of medieval childbirth were rarely spoken aloud. Women labored in silence, often biting down on cloth to stifle their screams. Privacy was scarce, and midwives, sometimes accused of witchcraft, faced blame if things went wrong. Superstitions dominated the process. Charms tied around waists, prayers to saints, and even bizarre rituals to ward off demons believed to attack mothers in labor. Without medical tools, midwives sometimes used crude instruments, leading to torn flesh and deadly infections. Babies born breech rarely survived, and mothers with obstructed labor suffered slow, excruciating deaths. These tragedies were so common that priests kept baptism water nearby, ready to bless infants who might live only minutes. It was a brutal reality that women accepted as fate, a silence preserved through generations. Medieval maternity was shrouded in silence, hidden behind heavy doors and whispered prayers. Women who entered the birthing chamber carried secrets that few dared to speak aloud. Midwives, both trusted and feared, often knew more about herbs and delivery techniques than most physicians, but their practices were dangerous. Some used sharp knives or hooks to extract infants when labor stalled, leaving mothers bleeding to death. Others relied on toxic herbs meant to speed delivery, which instead poisoned mother and child. Religious influence made the ordeal worse. Women were told pain was a divine punishment for Eve's sin. Few dared to question it. Families buried their daughters, wives, and sisters quietly, as if their suffering was simply part of life. The secrets of medieval childbirth remained locked away, unspoken for centuries, until historians uncovered the chilling truth. Midwives were the guardians of childbirth in the Middle Ages, yet they lived under constant suspicion. To families, they were a lifeline in desperate hours. To the church, however, they were dangerous women who dabbled in the unknown. Whispers of witchcraft followed them, especially when births went wrong. If a child died or a mother bled out, the midwife was often accused of consorting with demons. Despite this, women trusted them more than doctors, who were expensive and dismissive. Midwives used herbs, warm cloths, and whispered prayers to help laboring mothers. But even their best efforts couldn't fight infection or hemorrhage. Many midwives carried both respect and fear within their communities, hailed as saviors when they succeeded, condemned as witches when they failed. The fear of childbirth wasn't just about death, it was about the shadows of suspicion that followed everyone in the room. To be a mother in the Middle Ages was to live in constant dread of childbirth. Women endured multiple pregnancies, often from their teens, until death. Each birth carried risk: torn bodies, blood loss, or fevers that burned through villages like wildfire. Without pain relief, they screamed into pillows or clutched wooden crosses. Some died slowly, in agony, as midwives begged saints for mercy. Husbands often remarried quickly, leaving the first wife's suffering erased from memory. Children, too, rarely survived. Disease and hunger claimed many before they reached their first year. The endless cycle of suffering defined motherhood in this era, joy clouded by grief, hope smothered by fear. The world remembers kings, battles, and castles, but the silent agony of medieval mothers remains one of history's most tragic, untold stories. When historians study medieval childbirth, the practices they uncover are shocking. Women were often forced to deliver upright, gripping ropes or bedposts, believing it would ease the baby's fall. Some births took place on stucco-covered floors, where filth and germs thrived. If labor stalled, desperate midwives inserted hands without washing, spreading infection that killed mothers days later. Holy relics were tied to women's bellies, as priests muttered prayers over the cries of pain. In extreme cases, knives and hooks were used to remove unborn children, sacrificing one life for another. Many of these practices were rooted not in medicine but in superstition, and they claimed countless lives. For modern historians, the horror lies not only in the pain women endured, but also in the silence of the records, proof that suffering was expected, not questioned. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a gamble with impossible odds. Women lacked antibiotics, sanitation, or skilled medical intervention. Even something as simple as washing hands before assisting a birth was unheard of. Hemorrhage, obstructed labor, and puerperal fever were the most common killers. Noble women fared no better than peasant status offered no shield against infection. A queen might die just as easily as a farmer's wife. With women bearing children almost every 2 years, the constant exposure multiplied their chances of death. For families, maternal death was almost routine. Graveyards filled with young women whose only legacy was the children they left behind. The high mortality rates became so normal that society barely blinked when a mother perished. It wasn't neglected, was resignation to a fate everyone expected. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was not just a physical ordeal, but also a spiritual battlefield. People believed evil spirits lingered near pregnant women, ready to steal newborns. To ward them off, strange rituals were performed. Knives placed under pillows, holy water sprinkled across the bed, and charms tied around the mother's wrists. In some regions, bells were rung to frighten away demons. Superstitions ruled over medicine, and midwives often acted as both healers and protectors against the unseen. However, these rituals often distracted from the real dangers: blood loss, infection, and malnutrition. While a mother whispered prayers, her body weakened from hours of agony. Families clung to rituals in desperation, but in truth, they offered little protection. For countless women, these dangerous practices gave false hope, while the reality of death remained ever near.
Imagine a dimly lit chamber.
A woman screaming in agony while midwives rush around her with bowls of herbs and buckets of water. This was childbirth in medieval Europe. No anesthesia, no sterile instruments, and little understanding of anatomy. Labor could last for days, with the mother trapped in endless pain. Babies born breech often meant certain death for both child and mother. Midwives used force, sometimes tearing flesh with their bare hands. If the mother survived, she risked infection in the following days, with fevers that spread quickly in filthy living conditions. The smell of blood, sweat, and smoke from burning herbs filled the room. Unlike today's hospitals, childbirth was more like a battlefield: chaotic, brutal, and terrifying. It was not a miracle of life, but a test of survival. To give birth in the Middle Ages was to face pain beyond imagination. Without medicine, women endured every scream, every tear, and every drop of blood. Fear gripped them even before labor began, for they knew the risks all too well. Some prepared wills in advance, leaving what little they owned to their children. During birth, midwives urged women to pray, gripping rosaries as they cried out for mercy. For many, death was the final outcome. Their bodies laid to rest before their infants even opened their eyes. Those who survived were often left scarred, weak, and vulnerable to future dangers. The cycle of pain, fear, and death repeated endlessly, shaping the silent suffering of generations of women. Medieval childbirth was less a celebration of life and more a grim confrontation with mortality. The reality of childbirth in medieval times was written not in books, but in blood. Rooms turned into battlefields where women fought for their lives. Without clean tools, infections were rampant, spreading quickly from one birth to the next. Bleeding was almost unstoppable once it began, and women often faded away within hours. Those who survived sometimes carried lifelong injuries, torn muscles, incontinence, or infertility. Blood stained the straw beds, the sheets, and sometimes the hands of desperate midwives who tried everything to save mother and child. Noble families buried young wives, while peasants mourned mothers in silence. Each death was accepted as ordinary, though it was anything but. The bloody truth is simple. Medieval childbirth claimed more lives than wars, plagues, and famine combined. In the absence of trained doctors, midwives carried the burden of bringing new life into the world. Their knowledge came from tradition, not science, passed down from mother to daughter. Some were skilled, calming terrified women with herbs and warm water, guiding them through labor with patience. Others, however, were untrained, relying on dangerous practices and superstitions. A midwife's decisions often determined whether a woman lived or died. But even the best could not fight
Infection or hemorrhage.
when complications arose. Crude instruments were used, tearing bodies apart. Still, midwives remained essential, their presence both feared and respected. For women in labor, the midwife was their only hope, a fragile lifeline, in a room where life and death balanced on the edge of a knife. Knights rode into battle knowing death was possible, but for medieval women, the battlefield was their own bodies. Childbirth killed more women than most wars ever did. Unlike soldiers, women had no armor, no weapons, and no choice. Every pregnancy carried the shadow of death, and with frequent births, the risks multiplied. War left scars on kingdoms, but childbirth left graves in every village. Husbands feared the birthing bed as much as the battlefield, knowing they could lose wives and children in a single night. Mothers prepared for death each time, making confessions and seeking blessings before labor began. For women, the cries of childbirth were louder than the clash of swords. It was not war that haunted medieval Europe most, but the quiet, unseen deaths in homes where women fought their deadliest battles alone. The horrors of medieval maternity were rarely written down, leaving countless tragedies erased from history. Women endured labors that stretched for days, their bodies exhausted, their cries echoing through small homes. Many died nameless, buried in unmarked graves, remembered only by the children they left behind. The suffering of mothers was so common that it was considered ordinary, hardly worth recording. Even queens, who lived in castles, surrounded by attendants, faced the same dangers. Behind the grandeur of royal births were still deaths, blood, and tears. The forgotten mothers of history endured agony in silence, their voices lost to time. Only whispers and fragments of old records remind us today that medieval maternity was a nightmare of suffering so normalized that it vanished into the shadows of history. Behind the veil of medieval life lay nightmares that no one dared to discuss. Childbirth. Women went into labor knowing that survival was uncertain. Some bled to death within hours. Others died from fevers days later. And many babies never lived to see their first breath. Husbands mourned silently. Communities moved on. And life continued as if tragedy was routine. Mothers often begged for priests to baptize their infants during delivery, fearing the child might die unblessed. Midwives fought against hopeless odds, but their limited skills could not stop death from claiming both mother and child. These nightmares were passed from woman to woman in whispers, warnings of what awaited them. Yet, despite the terror, childbirth never stopped. It was a cycle of life, bound tightly with death and nightmare hidden beneath the silence of medieval history. During the Dark Ages, becoming a mother meant stepping into danger. Women married young, and by their teens, were already bearing children. With no understanding of anatomy, even simple complications became fatal. Malnutrition weakened mothers, while disease spread through dirty homes and villages. The birthing room became a place of risk, where every cry might be a woman's last. Mothers who survived were often left weakened for life, facing future pregnancies with fragile health. Communities grew, used to high maternal death, treating it as fate rather than tragedy. Husbands remarried quickly, but children grew up motherless, repeating the cycle in the next generation. In truth, medieval society thrived on the sacrifices of women who bore children under constant risk. Their lives, cut short by childbirth, were the silent foundation of the Dark Ages. What passed for medicine in the Middle Ages often killed more women than it saved. Midwives and healers relied on primitive practices, many rooted in superstition rather than knowledge. Women were forced to drink bitter herbal brews to speed labor, sometimes poisoning themselves and their babies. Others endured fumigations, where smoke from burning plants was believed to drive out evil spirits. Some were tied to birthing stools or made to squat over pits filled with herbs, inhaling toxic fumes. In complicated births, tools like knives and hooks were used crudely, leaving women torn apart. Hygiene was non-existent. Bloody rags were reused, hands went unwashed, and childbirth became a breeding ground for deadly infection. Thousands of women perished, not only because of nature's cruelty, but also because of these primitive, deadly practices. Pregnancy in the Middle Ages was rarely a time of joy. It was a shadowed path filled with fear. Women carried children with no guarantee of survival for themselves or their babies. Prenatal care did not exist. Instead, mothers relied on superstition and crude advice. Many women were malnourished, working in fields or households until the very moment of labor. Miscarriages were common, and little could be done to save premature infants. Even when pregnancies went to term, the cruel reality remained. Childbirth was often the end. Women lived in constant dread, not celebrating their swelling bellies, but fearing what would come. For some, pregnancy was seen as proof of a wife's duty, not her well-being. The cruelest part was that society accepted this suffering as natural and unavoidable price for continuing the family line. Though life in castles appeared vastly different from life in cottages, childbirth united women in one grim fate. A peasant gave birth on a straw bed in a smoky hut, while a queen labored in a candlelit chamber surrounded by attendants, but both faced the same deadly risks. Infection, bleeding, and obstructed labor showed no mercy for status or wealth. Royal physicians often interfered with dangerous remedies, while peasants depended on midwives and whispered prayers. In the end, both noblewomen and villagers were carried to their graves after childbirth, their names etched in sorrow. Mothers of all ranks suffered equally, proving that even power and gold could not protect a woman from the dangers of bringing life into the world. The birthing bed was the great equalizer, claiming queens and commoners alike. Motherhood in medieval Europe carried a cost greater than most could bear. Women were expected to produce heirs, often enduring pregnancies year after year. Each labor carried the risk of death, yet society placed little value on the suffering involved. Husbands needed heirs, kingdoms demanded succession, and peasants required children to help with work. Women became the silent backbone of society, their lives sacrificed to ensure family survival. The high price of motherhood was paid in blood, in tears, and in endless graves filled with young women who never lived past their 20s. Children, too, rarely survived, leaving families locked in grief. For every birth celebrated, there was another life lost. Motherhood was honored in name, but cruel in reality, a price women had no choice but to pay. Some childbirth rituals of the Middle Ages seem shocking to modern eyes. Women were given relics of saints to hold during labor, believing holiness could ease their pain. In some villages, holy words were carved into bread and fed to the mother for protection. Others placed knives under the bed to cut the pain away. Certain regions burned herbs in the room, not for sanitation, but to chase away demons believed to prey on mothers. Midwives whisper charms, sometimes binding cords around women's stomachs to force the baby down. These rituals were born of fear, not science. While families clung to faith and superstition, women's bodies suffered from neglect. The shocking truth is that these rituals, while meant to save lives, often prolonged agony and cost countless women their last breath. One of the most chilling aspects of medieval childbirth is the silence that followed maternal deaths. When women died giving birth, their deaths were rarely recorded in detail. Chronicles focused on kings and wars. While mothers were buried quietly, their struggles dismissed as ordinary. Families grieved, yet society accepted these tragedies as part of life. Even queens who perished in childbirth were mourned briefly before being replaced by new wives, tasked with producing heirs. This silence robbed women of their stories, erasing the countless sacrifices made on the birthing bed. It wasn't that their lives lacked value, but that death in childbirth was so common, it was barely seen as news. The silence speaks louder than words. It reveals a world where women's suffering was invisible, hidden in the shadows of history. Pregnancy in the Middle Ages was not a time of gentle care, but of hardship and fear. Women worked in fields, carried water, and managed households throughout their pregnancies, with little rest, even in the final months. Malnutrition was common, leaving mothers weak before labor even began. When childbirth arrived, women endured hours or even days of pain without relief. The screams of mothers echoed through cottages and castles alike, while families waited anxiously outside. After birth, recovery was rare. Infections spread quickly, and many mothers died within days. Even those who lived faced the burden of nursing infants without proper food or hygiene. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths added layers of grief. What women endured was not only physical pain, but the emotional weight of knowing each pregnancy could end in tragedy. Superstition guided nearly every step of childbirth in medieval times. Women wore charms around their necks, hoping to keep demons away. Some families buried knives in the doorway to prevent evil spirits from entering the birthing room. Others tied belts blessed by priests around the mother's waist to ease the baby's passage. If labor stalled, women were made to drink water mixed with ashes from burned herbs or holy scriptures. Midwives whispered incantations, and candles were lit not for light but to ward off unseen threats. Yet none of these practices could stop the real dangers: blood loss, infection, and obstructed births. These terrifying superstitions gave false hope while real solutions were unknown. For many women, their final hours were spent not only in agony, but surrounded by rituals that offered no true relief. For countless women in the Middle Ages, childbirth was not a hopeful event, but a desperate struggle. Few mothers entered labor, expecting to live. Many had already witnessed sisters, mothers, or neighbors perish in the same ordeal. They faced hours of agony without comfort, clutching crosses or relics as prayers filled the air. Midwives worked tirelessly, but their limited tools and knowledge rarely changed outcomes. The cries of labor often ended in silence, followed by mourning. Infants, too, were fragile, and many did not survive their first days. The struggle was endless. Mothers brought into the world under risk, only to grow into women who would face the same dangers. Hope was scarce. Instead, childbirth was a cycle of fear, loss, and acceptance. It was less a miracle of life, and more a ritual of survival. Midwives were keepers of secrets in medieval society. They knew rituals, herbs, and hidden methods passed down through generations. Some of these secrets offered comfort, like teas made from plants to calm pain. Others were far more dangerous potions that induced miscarriages, instruments hidden away for desperate situations, and whispered knowledge of life and death choices. To protect themselves, midwives kept much of their knowledge hidden from men and the church for fear of being accused of witchcraft. When a birth went wrong, they sometimes lied, saying that death was God's will, while privately blaming infection or blood loss. These secrets gave them power, but also placed them at risk. The midwife's hidden knowledge made her both respected and feared. In a world where science was absent, her secrets often decided who lived and who died. Survival during childbirth in the Middle Ages was a rarity rather than the norm. The lack of medical knowledge meant women faced overwhelming odds. Blood loss could not be controlled. Infections spread rapidly, and complications like breech births almost always ended in death. With multiple pregnancies throughout their lives, women's bodies weakened, leaving them vulnerable with each labor. Mortality rates were so high that families often expected mothers to die young. Sometimes before reaching 30, children grew up without mothers, while fathers remarried quickly to continue the cycle. Even queens and noble women surrounded by attendants succumbed to the same fate as peasants. Survival was not a guarantee, but a stroke of luck.
For medieval mothers, every birth was a gamble, and far too many lost the fight.
Their stories remind us how fragile life once was.
Childbirth in the Middle Ages existed at the crossroads of faith, fear, and death.
Women entered labor surrounded by prayers, relics, and whispered charms, yet deep inside they knew survival was uncertain. Faith gave them strength, but fear haunted every cry. Priests stood ready to baptize newborns the moment they emerged, fearing they might not live long enough for a proper ceremony. Families clung to religion, believing God's will decided the outcome. But no amount of faith could protect against infection, blood loss, or obstructed labor. Death lingered in every chamber, stealing mothers and infants alike. Those who survived often gave thanks to divine mercy,
While those who didn't were buried quietly, their struggles silenced.
Medieval childbirth was never just about life. It was a test of endurance where faith and fear walked hand in hand with death. For medieval women, childbirth was the greatest nightmare they would ever face. There was no anesthesia, no safe medical practice, and no guarantee of survival.
Mothers often labored for days, writhing in agony while midwives whispered prayers and tried crude remedies. Some watched their babies die during delivery.
Others took their final breath moments after giving life. Husbands stood powerless, fearing they would lose both wife and child in a single night. Even those who survived were scarred physically and emotionally for life. The nightmare was not rare, but repeated endlessly across villages and castles. Each birth brought both hope and terror, a gamble where joy could turn to grief in seconds. For mothers, the birthing bed was not a place of miracles, but a battlefield, and far too many never rose from it.